Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles Podcast, where I look to distill the best practices and best ideas of the world's most successful investors, families, and their family offices. I hope to provide thought-provoking opinions and feature amazing thought leaders to our listeners of the podcast with an eye towards the future of investing and successful families and their family offices. Today's session is titled Legal Counsel to Billionaires, Shares Planning Strategies for the Ultra Wealthy. Pardon for a little bit of the sensationalist title, but hey, it helps to draw listeners and podcasts, so it kind of works. We're very fortunate to have a special guest with us today, someone who I've been talking to for many, many years, but never met. Now, technically, we're not meeting, but I could see him on Zoom, and that would be Richard LeVine, who's a partner at Withers. When I hear from my families in the US and around the world, and given my interest in tax, estate planning, and wealth preservation, like who are among the top people that you listen to? Who has their pulse on what's going on globally? I don't know if there's a name that I honestly hear more commonly than Richard. So Richard LeVine is wonderful. And Withers Bergman has many people who are amazing. And there's other firms and people too. And many of them we've had on. But really, in terms of being a top person in the community, I don't know if it really gets much better than Richard. So one, it's an honor to be interviewing him. When we did a little preamble, he put me in my place, as he should, on a couple of issues, which hopefully we'll bring up today. So we like to go a little bit back and forth. Before we start, and to give context to the times, it's mid-November of 2020. So because these are recorded, you may listen to it a month from now, a year from now, or 10 years from now, and some of it may not be applicable anymore because we're talking about issues that could change rapidly, especially now after the election. I also wanted to give a shout out because it is Veterans Day. And here in America, veterans have been amazing. Kudos, my hat's off to them. We would not be the great country we are and be in a safe position that I hope we are if it wasn't for our amazing veterans. So I have had family members over the years, generationally in my family, that have been veterans. And again, I'd like to more than tip my cap to certainly thank them for their service to our country, America. Richard, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
So let me give a little bit of a context buildup. We've discussed offline, I guess you could say, the work that both you and I do on effectively advanced strategies and planning and actions that global families, or look at the world globally as they should, of great wealth should do. However, reality, the effort it would take, the complexity, procrastination, perhaps money, even among the super rich, all come into play. So you and I mentioned there is no one perfect strategy. It may be dozens and dozens and dozens of complex intertwined. And even then, there's various variables that could change it and it needs to be adapted. So it probably makes us feel smart that, oh yeah, here's 53 strategies that you could do that would make you incredibly, put that moat around your castle. The reality is, what motivates the person who makes decisions to even act on a couple of them? And how do you put in order what should be the sequence when the fact is they're probably not going to listen to all that you tell them, even though they're paying you?
Well, it's a process. And the one thing you have to explain to the client is the big value add in private client wealth planning discussions is the idea. It's having an advisor has the knowledge and experience to decide from among the 53 different techniques that are used one way or another, which are the 2 or 3 that are going to be most effective, most highly leveraged, most appropriate for this particular family. So a lot of times, people want to say, well, how much does this cost? And they want to see a long list of documents because they think if they're going to pay a lot of money, they should get a whole long list of documents. It's not, it's like, the plumber who comes and says, it's $200 to turn the wrench because he knows which nut has to be turned.
Yeah, very true. And, the reality is sometimes you do have to pick and choose, and you can't get everything you want through to the client, but what's going to be most important, what can make the greatest impact, and then what may they evolve into over time. let's talk a little bit. Again, I gave the context. We're right after the US elections in 2020. Some were, no one was sure. Well, we're still not exactly sure what happened, not 100%, but there was some concern among some people, one way or the other. One of the areas that caused people from a tax perspective is, well, oh my God, what would happen if there's a blue wave, if the Democrats win everything? Well, a lot of things could happen from a tax perspective. Although we're still a little unclear, we likely have some clarity. Let's make the assumption that Biden won the presidential election. The Republicans keep the Senate. We all know what's happening with the House. This little bit of a Midland, I'm not so sure is a bad thing. But nonetheless, why don't I hear your perspective of how it played out and the impact, and it will have some impact on taxation, income, capital gains, carried interest, and probably we'll dive into the estate tax as well. And again, I know we're talking US centric here. We will be more global as our conversation progresses.
Well, I think we're going to find ourselves in relatively similar circumstances to after the 2012 election, where people thought in advance of the election and before year end, the $5 million exemption is going to go down to $1 million. You must give away $4 million before the end of the year. And then, of course, there was, the McConnell was controlling the Senate after that. And they had a long government shutdown because they couldn't really find a mutually successful compromise. But as the government shutdown weighed on both sides, they eventually did what was a really modest tax bill, a much more modest tax bill than would have been expected if the Democrats had controlled all the branches of government at that point. So I think we will likely see something very similar here, which is, they will try to have a tax bill, they will try to fund the government, et cetera. But I think that there will be only modest changes and not dramatic changes.
That appears to be the case. So some of the concerns that some had, this is interesting in that even if you're maybe, and again, we're going to have a very open and honest discussion today. I hope no one's offended. You can make the argument that even though you may be on the more conservative side on taxation and regulation, that if Trump won, there would be uprisings. We're already seeing that have happened given COVID, given unemployment, given civil and social unrest and issues from Seattle to Portland to even in cities, Chicago and New York, that perhaps the Democrats winning the presidency, yet not having complete power, that little bit of balance might, it's shocking for me to say this, being a libertarian, it might be a good thing to a degree, given the uneasiness that we have now going on in the country.
I do think it's easier to calm down when you're not going to have dramatic changes imposed quickly after the election, and it has to have both sides buy in. So I think you're probably correct.
Yeah, I think that's just pretty obvious, kind of putting two and two together, but I felt it was needed to be said. It's funny when one party is in power, the people that have a different perspective, things are going to hell in a handbasket. I got to look at my alternatives. What are the options? I had that happen during Obama's era with my Tea Party and conservative members. And reversely, when Trump was in, I had my more liberal, ultra wealthy families say, things are going to hell in a handbasket. I have to get out of here or at least explore my options. So we've covered with Riaz, Joffrey from your firm about dual citizenship. I think there's a little confusion among even families of wealth of the difference between exploring and acting on dual citizenship and exploring getting a passport and being a resident or buying property and real estate in the country, but being a little bit more thoughtful and not rushing into things. If you could talk about the fluidity of residency and dual citizenship and the direction that you may recommend that a family that wants to explore things more globally, what's the best approach to take?
Well, people believe it's useful for the ultra high net worth families to diversify their passport portfolio. So there is some usefulness in having another passport. As you say, the United States is almost unique in taxing its citizens regardless of where they live. So even if you reside in some other country and you're subject to their tax rules on account of your residence, you're still subject to US tax on virtually all of your income. So it's one thing to get a second passport. It's another step to move somewhere else. But you really don't remove the U.S. tax burden until you formally renounce your U.S. citizenship and you give up your blue passport. So, and that is often a relatively emotional statement for native-born Americans, but it's the reality of how the rules work.
And let's talk a little bit about that. So you're correct. Oh, things go in a hell in a handbasket, no matter what your perspective, given who's in power and how you think things are. You explore options. You got your passport, your fluidity. You're looking at citizenship. Potentially because of the U.S., the onerous tax system, you look to completely break away. Again, family and emotional issues are strongly going to come into play. Oh, there's also something called an exit tax. Now, it's all relative. But if you're like a Forbes 200 level family or person at, a huge amount of billions, that's going to be a massive tax that you probably are really not going to, it's going to be very hard to pay that. So it's not as easy as it sounds.
No, you're absolutely right. There is an exit tax for all U.S. citizens with net worths over $2 million and for anyone who has held a green card for 7 different calendar years. So it's not free to leave. It subjects you to an exit tax to buy your freedom, which is one of the reasons why when we're counseling inbound clients, when we're counseling people from Europe or Asia who are looking to move to the United States, we often suggest to them, you really should think about buying a different passport than a US passport. You should think about acquiring maybe an EU passport where you can get a lot of good travel rights under that passport, but where the passport itself does not trigger tax. So here, not only does a passport trigger worldwide taxation on an annual basis, but obtaining a green card, once you step foot in the United States under the green card, you are now a US taxpayer until you give up the green card.
Yeah, I mean, very good points. And staying on the subject of residency and looking at options and dual citizenship, one thing that has become common in the US, and maybe it applies to other countries around the world, is depending on your linear descent and when your ancestors, a generation or two would be probably better, came here, you may be able to look at that. Like Italy, I think, is relatively pretty liberal from that perspective. Ireland, off the top of my head, might be. So for clients that appear to be a little more gung-ho about doing it, do you sometimes look at that, their linear heritage as being an option?
Yes, absolutely. And I believe that Malta has suspended their program, but I believe Cyprus still has a program for passport by investment. But there's also some very favorable regimes in Spain and Italy. There are some very, nice first world European countries where you can basically pay a fixed amount and you will not have to pay tax on any of your investment income. So there are lots of opportunities these days to take up residence in Spain and take up residence in Italy or Switzerland without facing the full brunt of their worldwide taxation and rates that might even exceed the US rates.
Yes. And I would say that your advice a couple of minutes ago is probably generally considered broadly the most applicable. An EU passport is very respected. You gave a couple of options with Italy and Spain, and probably although again, it is a buy-in, but for families of wealth, that may not be an issue. Probably Cyprus is probably the lowest hanging fruit, other than maybe the linear heritage perspective. Maybe 10 years ago, a Caribbean passport, depending on the country, had a little bit of clout, and it still has value, but it's become like less respected effectively around the world. It may be something you may want to explore because it appears cheaper and convenient. I get it. But an EU passport, if you're looking at this direction, to me appears to be the way to go.
I agree. If you're really worried about cataclysmic political change, then it seems to me trying to escape on the cheap is probably not the best way to go.
No, and a tiny Caribbean country is going to be subject to many, many different whims. We're going to get to that in foreign asset protection trust in about a minute or two. And I know it went a little out of favor about 12 or 13 years ago and has come back in favor. I actually just had Tim Draper on talking about how it's gotten creative on cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. But Switzerland and Singapore have become very hot. Now, Singapore is a country where you do got to renounce your citizenship. It has to be just that. Switzerland is not quite that strict, but it's a 10-year process and has required military if you have younger members. And it's really, really hard. I know it sounds, I don't know, like the ultimate become a citizen of Switzerland, but wouldn't a softer approach be Cyprus? Maybe get residency papers in Switzerland, open up a business there, maybe a family office if you're a wealthy family. That's going to be a much easier route to go and have some exposure to being active in Switzerland without the process. No matter who you are, I don't think there's any way around that 10-year process.
Correct. It is arduous to have full nationality rights in Switzerland, but it's a very attractive place to live.
It is. And let's not even get into Liechtenstein and Monaco. That's like 3 times harder. I hinted at it a couple of minutes ago. Let's talk a little bit about, and this applies, I guess, we're talking an American family, but families internationally may not want to have all their bets in their home country. So we often hear from wealthy families in the US to, yeah, they may have a private trust company. They may have LLCs and structures in places like Delaware, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Nevada. But the ultimate, you have to, besides that, do something offshore, which sounds logical. It's more difficult to get charging orders via an LLC and maybe divorce and lawsuits. So among the more common ones that I hear in my network are setting up foreign asset protection trust in Nevis and Cook Islands. Cook Islands has a pretty tough track record about not always listening to what the U.S. tells them to do. So that could be appealing to people. I get it, and maybe setting up a start over fund there, but this gets a little tricky. Why don't I let you answer that part 1, then I'll get into part 2.
Well, I really suggest to clients who are considering doing that, are you willing to go live with your money? That to me is sort of the entree question to whether it's worth exploring this further. Because what you really get if you have a Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust or a Nevis Asset Protection Trust is that they will not enforce orders of US courts against your trustee. They will make the person who wants to get money from you show up in their jurisdiction, bring a claim against you in that jurisdiction. Those jurisdictions generally do not permit contingent attorney's fees. So you're paying by the hour for lawyers to bring your claim against a trust where you may or may not be able to get a recovery. So they have relatively short statutes of limitations. That's why you often hear Cook Islands and Nevis, because they have very short statutes of limitation. Once the trust is created and someone has a claim against you, how much time do they have to go down to Nevis or go out to the Cook Islands and bring a claim against your trustee? So the hope is that if you put your money in some little island in the middle of the ocean, that your creditor won't get there in time. And that's one of the appeals. But if they can get jurisdiction over you, and if you're a US person living in the United States, a court in the United States can get jurisdiction over you. The judge can issue orders saying, bring the money back. The judge can hold you in contempt and throw you in jail for refusing to obey that order to bring the money back. So there are real legal risks if you go too far in sort of thumbing your nose at the US legal system. And so if you really, really are set on saying, if somebody sues me, I want them to get nothing, as opposed to saying, I want to be able to buy them off for pennies on the dollar. But if you really want them to get nothing, then you have to eliminate the jurisdiction of US courts over you, which means you have to leave. And for many people, that's just not an acceptable option.
No doubt about it. And that part 2 of that question was going to be, okay, technically the trust is in one of those jurisdictions that I noted, but then I am going to ask the question, where's the actual money? Now, do you really want to leave it in a tiny, tiny Caribbean island? Now, maybe if it's a modest amount of money, depending on your wealth at a bank, 5 or 10 million, okay, that I could see. But, and again, it's all relative to your wealth, but most are going to have it in a US bank to begin with, or if they want to get a little more creative, maybe offshore in Switzerland. But as you told me, that's not to stop the US government or the divorcee, the creditor, from forgetting about the destination of your trust and just going directly after the money. And these jurisdictions and banks will probably give in.
It's very interesting, and that's another aspect of the planning is where are you comfortable having your money custodied? What are the rules in the custody jurisdiction? Is there some helpfulness under local law? Maybe in Switzerland, you should put your money into an insurance policy, even if that insurance policy doesn't qualify as insurance for US tax purposes. For Swiss debtor-creditor law, it may well be an insurance policy that is outside the availability of your creditors. So you may get a level of asset protection from that policy, even if you're not getting any US tax benefits from that policy.
Very good point. Actually, we had on a very prominent Swiss attorney, Martin Michaels, and he discussed one of the benefits of buying, and there's 33 available at the moment, a Swiss bank, and it comes with complexities. They're probably less expensive than you think, but a lot of them are antiquated, dated. They don't make any money, and it's challenging. But theoretically, if you were to buy one and capitalize it, that money probably is not going to be repatriated back to the US. The Swiss is going to be very protective of this is a bank in Switzerland. This is a shareholder. They capitalized it. Swiss citizens are investing. So, but your access to that capital, well, it gets complicated, but it's going to be a little bit more limited. And again, to start off, I said there is no one perfect strategy. There's like 50, 60, 70, 100, and you're not going to do all of them anyway. Let's talk a little bit. Let's reverse that a little bit. How about a foreign citizen looking to be a little bit protective of prying eyes of their government, and they look at the US and say, great country, powerful military, contract law, discreet, private, kind of, a big force in the industry. Maybe I should be buying real estate in the US that could have certain tax advantages, or to help my country not find out as much stuff about me as I would like, could I invest through a Wyoming LLC, buy US resources, and the US is not sharing my information via the LLC in Wyoming with my country? I'm probably a little off there, Richard, but am I a little bit on the right track?
Oh, absolutely. It is really the height of irony that all of this international reporting was generated because the US said, we find confidentiality unacceptable, and we are the big elephant, and we are going to trample over all of you and force you to make disclosure about Americans. So we came up with FATCA, and we said every bank in the world is going to have to categorize every one of their customers to find out whether they are or are not an American, so that no American can hide their money in a bank outside the United States, in an insurance company, in a brokerage. So they all have to do KYC on their customers and say, oh my goodness, are you in the US? After we really strong-armed all the other governments around the world to getting rid of their banking secrecy and agreeing that their banks would disclose to the IRS, all the other countries looked at each other and said, well, once you make a hole in the banking secrecy law, you might as well just tear the wall down. Let's all do the same thing they did. We'll tell our voters, we didn't want to get rid of banking secrecy. They made us get rid of banking secrecy, but now that it's gone, we really want to know how much money you have in the bank. And that's what they did. They created the OECD created the Common Reporting Standard, CRS, and now all the other countries in the world, with very few exceptions, are members of CRS. And if you have money in their jurisdiction is going to tell the jurisdiction where you live how much money you have in their jurisdiction. So I think Egypt, the Philippines, there are a handful of countries that don't participate, but none of them are real major international money centers. What's curious is, because the United States had its own rule under FATCA and is getting all the information they care about under FATCA, we have refused to join CRS and make disclosure to any other country. What's also interesting is, around the same time, we explained to people, there's no such thing as bearer shares. We want to know who owns all of these companies. So all you little islands in the Caribbean that have bearer shares that can be used to buy and sell drugs and buy and fund criminal, no more funding criminal activity with bearer shares. we want to see a register of who owns every share of every company. Of course, the United States does not have such a thing. There is no register in Delaware or South Dakota or Wyoming or Nevada of who owns all the interests in their corporations or their LLCs. So I say it's the height of irony. We demanded that banking secrecy go away and shine light into all the corners of the world, except we are now the black hole in which information goes and never escapes.
It is an amazing irony. That's why I brought it up. And I guess for people international, that's going to be an appeal to them being active in the US. And I'm not saying for anything nefarious or bad going on. It's, their countries are what they consider to be overly prying and wanting to know their business. They have business partners, marriage, divorce, kids. There's illegitimate children. There's a million different reasons why people may want to keep their resources private. And that may change with the US as time goes by. But for now, that must be very appealing to people. And again, that is ironic internationally. Whenever you're talking about the moat around the castle, wealth preservation, I think I have to bring up the topic of divorce. Making good decisions to begin with, being disciplined, and those are all going to be valuable. But no matter what, divorce is, it's inevitable for some. It will happen. So you have the issue of how things are structured in trust, what's disclosed, a prenup, a postnup. I probably don't want to spend half an hour on it, but it's worthy of a couple of minutes if I could sit back and listen to your commentary.
Well, I do think for very high net worth families, it does make a lot of sense to have a prenuptial before you get married. If somebody's marrying into a very wealthy family, they have to understand that no disrespect, we're going to love you as long as you're part of our family, but you're not blood. And, this money is not yours if you stop being part of our family. Prenups are easier or harder to enforce in lots of different jurisdictions. And you may not know at the time that you get married where you're going to be residing at the time you or your spouse want to file for divorce. So one of the reasons to have trust planning on top of a prenup, to be very careful to keep all your property ring-fenced so that it's crystal clear you never gave any interest in that money to your spouse because it wasn't yours to give away. It was the trustees. This is very helpful in case you find yourself in a jurisdiction that won't enforce your prenup. It's also very helpful, to be aware. There are some jurisdictions much better for the non-money spouse. So before any ultra high net worth person decides to buy a flat in London, you should realize if your non-money spouse goes there and lives there for a few months while you're busy with your business or your flings or whatever, they're going to be able to file against you in England because you have a flat there and they're living in your flat there. And even if they don't own the flat, they're going to get the UK jurisdiction over your divorce case. And the UK is very non-money spouse favorable. So there are, as you say, we could go on a long time about marital protection, but you really do need layers of the onion, and you really do need to think about what happens if I move. It's not something that occurs to most people. I'm going to take a secondment somewhere. My family is going to send me somewhere to open a new branch of our business. Does that affect my marital rights? It does. And it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're in one of those families.
Very important. And about 2 years ago, we did a podcast dedicated, a very prominent attorney on divorce. And this is something we should update and do more of, but I felt it was worthy of at least a little bit of a discussion in the topic that we're talking about today. These may not be, because you may deem them to be more store value and investment questions, but I think they weave their way into the wealth preservation discussion. And given a little bit of me being, and my audience knows now, kind of libertarian, of course, I'm going to be concerned about fiat currencies. They're not backed by anything, full faith and credit of the government. And as now we have COVID, we have deficits running wild and taxes and all sorts of challenging issues. From my opinion, a family of wealth should at least explore the ownership of gold and cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin. Me, Gold would likely maybe a little bit be stored very safely in a home or something close to safety deposit box, but likely we're talking more gold bullion and probably offshore, whether it's Switzerland, whether it's outside of the banking entity, like a Brinks location. Switzerland, Singapore arguably could be too. Bitcoin is going to be more of a complex discussion. My audience knows I cover that quite a bit. There are some risks depending on how you store it, your custody, cold storage, hard wallet, multi-sig. Is it in your head? But what happens if you get kidnapped? I mean, there's not one easy answer to any of this, but for your families that have wealth and really look to preserve it, would you say they at least be familiar with things like gold and Bitcoin?
I absolutely do. And as you say, the ability to move value without leaving an explicit trail immediately is of value to people who have interests in different countries around the world. I do think for Americans, it is a little more restricted. The ultimate, the total secret's a little more restricted because, the IRS in 2014 came out with a notice that said, anytime you spend Bitcoin, it's like you sold the Bitcoin. So you might think I'm buying something with my Bitcoin, and therefore, when you buy, you don't owe tax. But if you are selling the Bitcoin to get the real estate or the corporate shares you bought, then you are in fact disposing of the Bitcoin. So for American people, it's not as fully useful if you're going to make full disclosure. The other thing is, as you say, there's lots of different ways to hold your cryptocurrency. So to the extent that you hold your cryptocurrency on an exchange, you might find that's better because I find it more convenient to access my Bitcoin and check on it and use it. But those exchanges in many cases have sort of conceded that they have to report to the IRS when an income event happens to your account. So you may find that 1099s are going from your coin bank to the IRS, and so you better be including your Bitcoin transactions on your tax return. They added last year Schedule 1, which calls for disclosure of cryptocurrency. So I don't think that is something that you should just ignore and say, well, they'll never enforce it. I mean, just recently, the IRS got rid of one of their disclosure regimes. They said, we're no longer just interested in saying, I don't owe any tax, so I'll just send you the returns with no tax and no penalty. They got rid of that and said, no, we have a streamlined program. If you're eligible for that, you can use that. If you're not eligible for that, we're going to throw the book at you. So you really need to think long and hard in these times. Am I willing to risk not making full disclosure of everything the IRS is asking for me? Because years later, you could find yourself in a very difficult position.
For sure. And there are some ironies here as well. Ironically, cash, just paying something for cash is off the grid, so to speak, but it depends on how much cash you're taking out, because again, that could be deemed to be money laundering. And again, the banks and the governments are going to be here in the US very familiar with that. Gold is pretty darn close to being off the grid, but I would remind people, 1933 FDR, illegal for Americans to hold gold, turn it in, we're going to pay you this. If you don't, you're a criminal. I don't know if that was heavily enforced, but in theory, it could be. So those are also potential risk. And here's the irony. I am a fan of Bitcoin for the most part in cryptocurrencies, even as a store of value, but it certainly could be volatile. But the blockchain has many advantages. But one of the arguably disadvantages is it leaves a complete trail. So if you pay someone for a coffee shop, I buy a $5 coffee with Bitcoin, as if that's convenient. It's not. But let's just say you do. In theory, they could see the other transactions you made, like, wow, this guy sent 100 million. He must be rich. Let me kidnap him. And governments, now they have done it. They have tracked criminals. So I guess you could say they're bad apples, and maybe this is a good thing. But it could provide a trail which you could argue has some good things about it, but could be a little bit dangerous as well. We don't have time to get into Zcash and stuff like that. That is a little bit more private. Why don't we stop there? But I do think that I'm lumping bolding Bitcoin together as store of value and cash, but the reality is they are valuable. Families should be familiar with it. But again, here we go again. There is no one perfect strategy. There's lots of things you have to do.
I would like to say one more thing about gold. sort of the same thing about whether you have a wallet for your Bitcoin. If you're going to store gold in a depository, and you may say, well, it's very, very safe because they won't let anybody else take it out. Well, that's true if you are dealing directly with the vault, so that it's your retina that's been scanned and it's your ID they're going to ask for, and you're the one paying the storage fees every month, and they know you, so that when you show up and say, I want to withdraw some of the bullion, they will let you in. Many ultra high net worth families are going to have their gold bullion in an entity, maybe a trust that owns an investment company, and the investment company owns the gold. They don't know you from Adam. They know the manager of that LLC. They know the director of that company. And if the world is a problematic place and you have to take your private jet and show up at the vault and say, I want my money out, you better have that guy in the car with you, so that he will verify, yes, you're really the owner. Because, if you have bearer certificates, we had some clients who did this. They kept their money in bearer certificate gold bullion.
Yep.
Well, that means if anybody takes your certificate, they can show up and get the money.
And that basically is the keys to Bitcoin. It's bearer. You have the keys. It's your asset. I mean, those are, again, some of the risk. And even gold as a tremendous hedge or flight risk. 1 ton of gold, that's a hell of a lot of gold. 1 ton of gold is 60 million. I'm not discounting 60 million. I'm being approximate. But if you're worth $10 billion, it's a little bit of a drop in the bucket. But again, all these things kind of add up. And yeah, you bring up good points there. And there are people that refuse to keep their gold, even offshore in banks, for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier on foreign asset protection trust in the US. And they use Brinks or another outside company, which might have advantages. You're going to have to make your own decision on that. And again, we could spend hours on this topic. It is kind of interesting and sexy, but why don't we move on? So 2 topics that we've covered a fair amount is owning banks offshore. We did that with Martin Michaels in Switzerland. And I do think there are some advantages, but it gets complex. You have to purchase, you have to capitalize. Yeah, your money is probably pretty darn safe from repatriation, but your access to that capital, yeah, you get some risk controls over the custodian and bank. You get access to deal flow, what others are doing. I think there are advantages, but there's complexities as well, especially for a US citizen. The other topic that we covered with one of your colleagues at Ren that you're very active in as well is setting up offshore captive and reinsurance companies. Again, these are subjects that get very deep, very complex. We could do hours and hours on each of them. But if you had to cover them from your perspective as a 1-2 punch, giving an overview, I'd love to hear your opinion.
Well, some of these are very helpful because there are special exceptions in the tax code. So whereas a U.S. individual, if she owns a foreign corporation, you have the subpart F rules where you have to pay U.S. tax on the interest, dividends, capital gains, and other investment income that's generated inside your company, even if they don't pay you any dividends. And now we have the GILTI rules where you have to pay tax on the active business income that is generated inside your company, even if they pay you no dividends. So one of the nice things about buying a bank or buying an insurance company is you may find that those kinds of income are exceptions to having to fully report all of the operational level income of these foreign companies on your own personal tax return. So there is some benefit there. As you say, it comes at a cost and lots of complexity.
Lots of complexity. But yes, for families of great wealth, when they're looking at, again, at 100 different kind of strategies, those are 2 on the more complex side that probably, especially in my opinion, for a billionaire plus families, that should at least be addressed and very rarely are. I mean, you're unique, Richard, and there's maybe 15 or 20 from my experiences like you. So I'm glad that it's something that you're very fluid in. There is something that you're extremely knowledgeable about, one of the world leaders about, that does have some of the elements, in my opinion, of creating an insurance company or a bank. I think it's one of the greatest vehicles out there. My audience knows I'm a big fan of it from an alternative investing perspective, tax perspective, first in, first out, cash access, asset protection, especially arguably if it's offshore. Talk a little bit, and this one we could go a little longer on, was I think it's important. And compared to banks and insurers, it's way easier. I think it's horrifically underutilized, and that is private placement life insurance.
Thanks, Angelo. I'm happy to talk about that. So Private placement life insurance takes advantage of the rule that says, as long as you structure the policy properly, there is no tax to the holder of the insurance policy when there is income or gains generated inside the policy. So you can churn a portfolio and something that you might have a hedge fund that you own that is all short-term gain. It makes a nice headline rate, but by the time you have to pay tax on the management fee that you're not allowed to deduct anymore, and have to pay federal tax on the state tax that you can't deduct anymore, and everything is coming at you at short-term gain at the highest marginal ordinary income rates, really gets punished under the tax rules. So you can take that portfolio and put it inside a life insurance policy, and the holder of the policy doesn't have to pay tax on anything that happens inside that policy. Moreover, if you structure it properly, if you pay the premiums in over 18 months, 24 months, 30 months, you can have your insurance policy qualify as not a modified endowment contract. And you want a policy that is not a modified endowment contract because you can borrow from the policy even amounts in excess of the premiums you initially paid. You can borrow out the growth in the policy, and those borrowings will be treated as loan proceeds. And generally speaking, when you borrow money from the bank, you don't have to pay tax on the dollars they give you because eventually you'll have to pay them back. So here you can borrow dollars against your life insurance policy, and because you're going to have to pay them back when you die, you don't have to pay any tax when the life insurance policy gives you the money, or your trust borrows from the life insurance policy and the trustee makes a distribution. Now, why do we talk about private placement life insurance? We talk about private placement life insurance in the ultra high net worth space because regular policies, when you first got married, you had your first kid, and the insurance agent showed up and said, you need to buy $1 million of life insurance so you can pay for college and pay off the mortgage on your house. Give me $10,000 and I'll sell you $1 million of life insurance. Those policies have enormous commissions. Generally, the first premium check is paid over in full to the agent. They don't have any cash value, so you don't get any of your money back in the interim. You're just, you're sort of betting on going to die. And the investment choices in those policies are very limited. The private placement space is where insurance companies who are catering to the ultra high net worth families have created products with far greater expanded investment alternatives. In fact, in addition to, most of the carriers will have a long list of funds that they will let you allocate to. Most of the carriers these days will allow you to have a separately managed account and hire an allocator to manage the portfolio. This is relatively new in the space. The IRS has liberalized what were 15 years ago very restrictive rules on how PPLI money, how the cash value can be invested. The IRS has relaxed those rules. So it's now a much more attractive product. The commissions are on a very different basis. Instead of getting 100% of the first year premium, the agent is getting basis points, like a single digit of basis points per year during the life of the policy. And that's one of the reasons it's not marketed as often and as hard as some of the other products, because it takes an agent who is willing to invest time in learning about the policy and going around and trying to sell that kind of policy. And it's much easier to tell someone, give me 10 grand, you'll get $1 million of coverage, than to tell someone, give me $2 million and I'll give you $2,250,000 worth of death benefit. It sounds like a terrible deal. And many of the ultra high net worth families will say, hey, wait a minute. When I bought life insurance before, my brother-in-law, the agent, used the premiums I paid to buy a Ferrari. I don't want to buy that person a boat. My agent, she's a wonderful person. She keeps me up to date on my policy. She's never told me about PPLI. No one at my club has a PPLI policy. If you invest a little in exploring this space, you will find you can have very tailored investment portfolios. And instead of paying tax rates that may be in excess of 50%, again, like I said, you're paying tax on the management fee that you don't get to keep. you're paying tax on the state taxes that you just sent to the state capital. So you're paying tax on more than the dollars you eventually get to keep. So the tax rate can be enormous. This way, you pay the cost of the insurance policy. Maybe it is over the course of 5 to 7 years, 80, 90, 100 basis points at the highest. The longer you hold the policy, the less it costs on average. So long hold, paying 60 basis points to have a life insurance portfolio is going to crush on an after-tax return basis, even at the same amount of gross investment return in the underlying portfolio. If you have to pay 50% in taxes, that's going to be a lot more than 60 basis points, unless you're making only 1 or 2% on your portfolio, in which case you should get a new investment advisor.
Like you said, I mean, there's tremendous benefits. We didn't even get into the unique aspect of technically being a life insurance contract as FICO first in or FIFO first in, first out. Some of the access on wash loans. I mean, there's tremendous benefits. And if you say, well, I'm older, I'm uninsurable, if you have family members, a son or grandson, whatever, that's younger, and you're looking at this as a multi-generational strategy, there are variations you could do, involve gifting and setting up trust. So yes, it could get complex, but in my opinion, compared to setting up multiple offshore captive and reinsurers, it's way easier and may do a better job of some of the benefits that you wanted. Richard knows this person, so I'll mention it, but if you go to my YouTube channel, which is Family Office, we did a deep, probably about an hour and 20 minutes. And even then there's more we could do on private placement life insurance with Brad Barros. So, go to my channel, take a look at that. But it's something that, again, I think is wickedly underutilized among the ultra affluent. Let's jump maybe a little quicker into a couple of others. We do see some families setting up effectively what amounts to commercial alternative investment companies, whether PE, venture capital, and they set up a GPLP structure. And then some of the attorneys that get very cute and smart talk about the tax advantages, carried interest. This is something that gets very complex. I know you don't want to give away all the Withers secrets on this one, but maybe talk a little bit about, there could be some tax advantages to setting up that kind of structure, but also it comes with its negatives too.
So I just want to say one more thing about insurance. It's a great asset class if you've already used up all your lifetime exemption, because you do not have to put a seed gift into a trust to loan money to the trust to pay insurance premium. You can do 100% debt financing. So for a person who has used up their lifetime exemption already, they can freeze their estate by loaning tons of money to a trust for their kids that buys an insurance policy and taking back a noted AFR that these days, may bear a return of less than 1%.
Yeah.
All the growth on that money above the 1% is going to the trust for your kids with no gift tax. So that's a very important technique for people who've already used all their lifetime exemption. So if you want to talk about setting up an internal fund, what we find is a lot of people, wealthy families, have a family office and they employ several people or maybe many people to manage their investments, to provide concierge services, do bill paying. There's a lot of things that a family office can take care of for you. The question is, how do you fund the family office? And under current tax law, it's very hard to fund the family office by paying fees. The traditional model was the family office will charge each entity in the family structure. Each trust will pay for whatever services they get from the family office. And that's very nice from a tidiness. Everybody is paying their own share. It's very neat in terms of perfectly aligning which family entity had to pay the costs of which family office services. The problem is, under the current tax law, many of those payments are not deductible at all. So you have to use after-tax money to fund the expenses of your family office. So we would suggest to families in this situation that they have all of the family entities enter into a partnership to pool their investment portfolios, have the family office be the general partner of that, and take a carry just like you would in a hedge fund or a private equity fund. Take a percentage of the profits as their compensation. The nice thing about that is that's not a deductible payment by the various trusts. That's just income that never hits the trusts because it's allocated over to the family office. Now, it's harder to do it that way and always perfectly line up the amount that got allocated to the family office with the amount of expenses the family office had. So you may have a little bit of juggling to do. One year you paid the family office a little too much. The next year, maybe you'll aim for a target percentage that's a little smaller. They may be short. Hopefully it offsets. If not, the family can loan the family office some money until the next year. So as you say, more complexity, but a tremendous value add because you're now using pre-tax dollars to fund the family office. And in many cases, since the family office is engaged in an active trader business of doing, services, that they can deduct all their expenses. They can deduct all the salaries they pay to their employees, the salaries, the bonuses, the rent, the office equipment, all the stuff that might not be deductible by the trust is now deductible by the family office, and the trust paid with pre-tax dollars.
Yeah, I mean, there's much on this now because it kind of came to head with the lender family versus the IRS December of 2017. There's lots of resources on it. Just look it up. And Richard and I are both based in Connecticut. And the lender family, who I've known for a while, is a Connecticut-based family. Those of you in the Northeast would, of course, remember, if you're a little bit older like me and Richard, Lender's Bagels. So there has not been many cases where the IRS has challenged something that we look at in the family office world, and the family office won. You look back to Higgins, which goes back like decades ago. Seems like the family offices always lose. Now, this is no guarantee it's going to work for everyone. And again, it may not, but it gives a little bit of a roadmap to follow of what could potentially work to get some tax enhancements. I'm going to skip over a little bit. I had on my notes to talk a little bit about farms. How about that, Richard? Two guys in Connecticut talking about farms. But again, there's we're a believer in families owning more potentially direct businesses. Something that you can't produce more of, like land, something that produces food, is always going to be valuable. And there are depreciation benefits. One person internationally did remind me, yeah, Angelo, my family used to do that until the government said it's needed by the government and they took control of our farm. Oof. And that's not impossible here. They could do that through eminent domain. So I'm still an advocate of considering farm and ranch land, but that's probably a little out of left field for some, so we'll probably just skip it. But I am going to talk about something kind of related to it, and it's among the most common assets of the ultra wealthy, and that's real estate. And the news came out, and maybe it's wrong, from the New York Times that the president only paid a couple of $100 a couple of years ago, and honestly, I was really not surprised, and don't necessarily look at that as being a negative. He has really, really, really good tax advisors. And here's likely what happened. He owns hundreds of real estate properties, each in separate LLCs, probably has no guarantees on any of them, which was a smart move. Some of them lose money. You also have in real estate passive income, passive losses. You have 1031 exchanges. There's a variety of factors why in the US and probably in other countries, there's advantages to owning real estate. And for those that are very, very smart about it and have diversity in it and keep on upticking in 1031 exchanges. Now, then the question may be, well, how are they so rich? Well, they have the appreciation that they're accessing with financing. Where that could go wrong is a little bit of what we're seeing now, which is COVID comes along, commercial real estate starts to collapse, they're over levered. Now you have a problem with that strategy. I really queued you up pretty well there, Richard, but real estate is something that I think we have to dive into because it is a powerful aspect of wealth preservation for families.
Well, it certainly is. It tends to be an enduring store of value. It is tax favored in the United States. There are a lot of rules in the tax code that say you cannot deduct this, you cannot deduct this, unless you're in real estate, and then you can. You have to pay tax on this, yeah, right? So, the passive loss rules have exceptions for, real estate investors, and you only have to work like 750 hours a year, not 2,000 hours a year to be a full-time real estate professional. So there's a lot of favorable rules, as you say. You get non-tax deductions for depreciation. So you're getting to write off dollars you aren't actually spending. You get to write off the dollars you pay for interest on debt. And you don't have to pay tax on the principal amount of the money you borrow against your real estate. You can roll it over and roll it over and roll it over to bigger projects, and then wait till you die. And under current law, you get a basis step up at death, and all of your gains in that property are wiped out by death. So it's a very attractive asset class. As you mentioned, sometimes there are also property tax benefits to running a farm or another kind of business on the land. So if you're the kind of person who wants to really have a large estate, you want to have a place the family can have family retreats at, do some of the education. How do you get the younger generation involved in the family? You have a retreat, so maybe you want to buy a large parcel of land. If you want to buy a large parcel of land, you'll have significant property taxes. Maybe running a business is, it could produce a lower property tax bill, and it can also be a vehicle. You know, I like real estate or charitable work as methods of educating the younger generations. Give them something that is not going to break the family to run at a relatively young age. And not only will the younger generation learn that it's not so easy to build wealth and to expand wealth, they will also see it's really hard to decide where we should spend our money. So you'll find who has a good feel for which aspects of the family's enterprise if you start people at a young age and get them involved in their family farming operations or get them involved in their family charitable operations. It's not going to affect the family's net worth very much, but it might very much impact who gets assigned which roles when they get to be older.
Absolutely. And there's other benefits, and most families don't make it of great wealth past 3 generations. And for sure, taxes and investing play a part of it. But often it's internal issues, it's conflict, it's lack of next generation education. And yeah, you could passively invest in a company, but do you really learn about it? The advantage of investing in something hands-on like real estate and private businesses is you see like the reality. It's hard. How businesses are run, what's successful, what's not successful. You get your hands a little dirty. It's deeply educational for the family. And we don't have time to get into charitable and philanthropic benefits, but if you're talking about wealth preservation, the irony is that does play into the conversation as well. We'll save that one for a different time. I have 2 quick questions left, but there is a question that came in from the audience, so I'm going to ask it. What happens with real estate if the step up in cost basis is removed? What is a good strategy if it disappears?
Well, what that means is if you ever sell, you would have to pay tax. But there's nothing that necessarily forces you to sell. So as we've said, and even if you do sell, you only have to pay tax if you don't reinvest in another parcel of real estate. So whereas up till now, most families have bought and borrowed and bought and borrowed and rolled and waited until the senior generation, when grandma died, you got a basis step up, and then you could diversify out of real estate. It will make it a little more difficult to diversify out of real estate because you really want to roll those proceeds over into other pieces of real estate under 1031 to be able to keep deferring your tax.
I should have brought it up earlier when I did mention for those that maybe don't immediately want to go the foreign asset protection trust, and we gave some where it may have some little advantages, some where maybe it's a little overrated. For a U.S. citizen, and we already discussed international coming to the U.S., some of the benefits they would get, but for a U.S. citizen, when you're looking at the various states, probably the ones that come into play are Delaware, New Hampshire, Alaska, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nevada. I think I got most of the big ones there because of their privacy laws, because of other value added. For a family that's concerned about lawsuits and wealth preservation, which one among those states would you rank as the best?
Well, I think it depends upon what is the liability you're trying to protect against. If you're worried about marital claims from somebody's spouse, Nevada is generally recognized as the best state. But if you're just worried about you hit somebody with your car or somebody gets hurt at a party at your house. I think South Dakota is a very good state. South Dakota, Delaware, Alaska generally are in a race, each of them in their state legislatures, to revising their law to be just as good as the other state. As soon as anybody makes a move, the other 2 react. But I think it's probably better to think about it as, why don't you have a portfolio? Like I said, you might want a passport portfolio where you have more than one passport. You may well want a jurisdictional portfolio where you don't have all of your assets in one vehicle in one location.
I'm getting a little off topic, but I find Wyoming to be intriguing. And I've been there several times, by the way, for people that are wondering. I even drove there. How about that, to Yellowstone Park? I believe it was where the first LLC was created, and they're being hyper creative on effectively cryptocurrency banks. They're well ahead of everyone else in the US and to some degree, even in the world. So stay tuned. In the world of Bitcoin and crypto, that's going to be a big thing. And Wyoming's very creative from that perspective.
And it's also by far
Yes.
the best place for private trust companies for, where they don't require a lot of capital. There's not a lot of stringent regulation. So if you do have a number of trusts in your family and you're tired of paying outrageous fees to a commercial trust company, you can save yourself a lot of money by having a Wyoming unregulated private trust company.
Richard, you're not going to believe this. Guess what my last question was about? PTC, private trust company.
There you go.
So, yeah, I mean, South Dakota probably gets a little more acclaim, but Wyoming, you could do both regulated and unregulated. I don't know if you want to get too deep into that. We did a significant
families have different views.
podcast in the past in June, and you can look that up on my YouTube channel too, which again is Family Office with South Dakota Trust Company. So yeah, they're going to be a little skewed to South Dakota, but he's incredibly intelligent about the subject. So yes, I would love to hear your opinion. I look at it from a perspective of it condenses things into one as a trustee. It could be a trustee of hard to find corporate trustee assets on. And it's great as a family governance vehicle in terms of how it could be structured. Plus, you could also get D&O, E&O, and other forms of insurance that is hard to get in other type of trust and other structures. But from your opinion, and maybe a little focused on Wyoming, where do you think families of wealth and even international ones should look in the US and Wyoming at a private trust company?
Okay, Al King has been doing this a long time. He's got a very good setup there. In
Al
South
King,
Dakota.
that's him.
Go wrong. You can't go wrong going Al King. Look, South Dakota is probably the best if you want light regulation, but you do want to be regulated, and you do want to be, if your family is on the spectrum more concerned that something's going to go wrong and someone's going to steal your money, then going with a regulated vehicle in South Dakota gives you that a little additional comfort that nobody will embezzle from you and it won't go noticed because maybe the regulator will notice. But if your real concern is confidentiality and flexibility of investment, then maybe the unregulated model in Wyoming would be more to your liking.
Yeah, I mean, you went over a little bit when we indirectly discussed lender versus the IRS and setting up structures with carried interest. We didn't even get into what qualifies in the US as a single family office from the exemption from registration. And it's moderately liberal. We'll save that for a different time. But for families that may not qualify, setting up a private trust company is also, and I think it has many, many other benefits. And Al King really is a true thought leader in it and a fellow Connecticut resident. So we like Al because of that as well. Joining us, Ray Dalio, and a couple of others there, I might add, Richard. But yeah, I mean, it's a very, very unique vehicle. I mean, Alice helped it to kind of become popular among the ultra wealthy, but it does so much. And I even looked at it for international relationships that have resources and interest here in the US as well. I find it to be a very powerful vehicle that maybe because it's a little complex and regulated is a little bit expensive, that, it tends to be one that gets pushed a little bit to the side sometimes by families.
Look, I once had a client, I think at the time he was worth about $250 million. And he had his primary personal banking relationship with Citi. And I suggested he form a Wyoming PTC, and his banker said, "That's ridiculous. You're not rich enough to have a PTC, so you should let us be the trustee of all your trusts." And I said, "Okay." He's got 15 trusts. What are you going to charge? I think they were like, "Well, it's going to be $150,000 for us to administer 15 trusts." I was like, "It's going to cost him $20,000 to set up the PTC and $5,000 a year to run it. If you can convince him to spend another $120,000 a year so you can be trustee, God bless."
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a non-regulated, that could be 15, 25,000, a little bit more in terms of some structures, arguably for regulated. And I guess the point that I was going to make was if you don't quite qualify for the exemption, setting up your family office and your trust within the concept of a regulated private trust company, you're exchanging effectively SEC for state banking. They don't like to hear this, but usually for families, that's a good trade-off.
I think that's absolutely a very good trade-off.
Wow, Richard, we did kind of go around the horn a little bit, and I still feel there were things we left not covered because we could be here for hours and hours, or deeper dives in. That'll be a chance to have you on in the future. For families that would like to learn more about you and your, again, Withers is a global firm. I hope it should be renowned among families of wealth, but how could they learn more about you and the firm, and how could they reach out?
Well, our website is withersworldwide.com. I'm Richard.LeVine at withersworldwide.com. And, there's a search page there. If you, put in LeVine, you'll get me. And, the firm has offices around the world. We have offices in most of the leading money centers. We're in Hong Kong, we're in Singapore, we're in Switzerland, we're in London. We're on the East Coast and West Coast of the United States. So we do circle the globe, and we do have US tax lawyers in most or all of those locations. So we really are quite unique in that if we have 500 lawyers, we have 200 tax lawyers, and they're distributed all around the globe, as opposed to most firms where you might have 20 tax lawyers out of 200, and half of them would be in one office. So you're really able to access the knowledge base regardless of your time zone, regardless of your geographic location. And if you're a US person outside the United States, you don't have to worry that if I call when it's daytime where I am, there are no US lawyers who are going to be available until it becomes daytime in the United States. There will be US trained tax lawyers wherever you are to be able to handle your concerns.
That's a great point. And by the way, if you're looking up Richard online or through the Withers website, which is great, Richard is pretty obvious, but I'll spell his last name Levine. So Richard is truly a treasure, both not just here in the US, but internationally. We encourage you, if you have something that may be applicable for him, certainly have a chance to reach out, learn of the work they do. Everyone, I'm going to do a little bit more of an extensive close today because this is a subject kind of close to my heart. So I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles Podcast, and I'm the founder and CEO at, as you all now know, Greenwich, Connecticut based, but international family office association. And really during COVID, where now we're like 8 or 9 months in, and I'm not on a plane 21 times a year, and I got more of a chance to, I hope, be more of a thought leader, dive deeper into subjects, talk to my biggest of big families, get ideas from them, and then scour the world for the leading authorities and experts. For a lot of these families, they're already rich. They want the moat around the castle. They want to have at least optionality on their generational wealth and have a say in what goes on, and are concerned about various so many different things, the government entities, et cetera, kind of pulling on their resources and money. So when it comes to wealth preservation, that really is an anchor for who we are as an organization. So what do? We provide a significant amount of original proprietary content. During normal times, not COVID, we host events around the world and have featured and interviewed amazing guests like Ray Dalio, Peter Thiel, Tony Robbins, and so many others. But let's not despair that we'll come back one day sooner, relatively likely than later. But we're more active than ever. As opposed to doing 10 events, I'm doing 200 now because we're hosting often 4 days a week, sometimes twice a day like today, much deeper dive interviews than ones that go too quickly at an event. So from an intellectual perspective, and not just an event that comes and goes, but often recorded, at least for our members to have access end of the week, maybe end of the year, maybe years from now. So that opportunity is really, really, really important. We're extremely active as a thought leader, and I help families on these issues. They may come to me and say, could you make an introduction to someone like a Richard or like someone in Switzerland or Singapore, and how I could be of value? Maybe I could help negotiate some favorable terms. I don't know. So there's a variety of ways that being a member of Family Office Association, and hopefully this interview, you saw a little bit of my passion about the subject. I'm lucky to know a thing or two about it. And one that, again, that we're now more of a global organization than ever before and have relationships in Asia and Europe and really practically every continent. It really gives me access resources, knowledge, my research, my surveys, the information we get back, and how we could provide value, which also includes, which we added this summer, you could go to our website and find out how I could help to quarterback the process in creating or reinventing a family office, which I really only take on about 2 or 3 such assignments a year, but lately they have been a lot of fun. I will remind people, like I started off, specific to today's discussion, it's great that it's recorded, but again, it's very sensitive to tax, estate, and other issues that here November of 2020, some of it is black and white, some of it's a little gray, and you need to do your own diligence based on your own situation and talk to your own advisors. But that gets amplified when you hear it a day later, a week later, a month later, 10 years later, because things change, taxes, government regimes, I could go on and on. So this is meant to be educational, entertainment at the given moment, and you still have to do your own diligence. So one, I hope you all, and obviously Richard would agree, understand that. If I spoke a little passionately about what we do at Family Office Association and why wealth preservation is so important to me and to us, hopefully that comes across in a very positive way, because it is something that we take pride in our intellectual firepower, the depth of our Rolodex, and the resources that we bring to our relationships. Check us out on social media. We're Family Office on YouTube, which is probably now our most active platform. We're very active even on Instagram and LinkedIn. And my direct website is simply our company name, familyofficeassociation.com. Membership options and more are easily accessible through that. And my direct email is angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. Well, that was a long close, even by my standards. Richard, you've been a great guest. Withers has been a great aligned relationship of mine for many, many, many years. I'm glad to have it and glad that we finally a little bit more personally connected, and your depth of knowledge and your ability to articulate it is amazing. I'm honored to have had the discussion today.
Glad to be here with you.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy.